I didn't think to start off with an opening slide about myself, so I'll just wing it a little bit. I have been in the technology industry for, 18 years, I would say. And in most respects, I was doing technology at companies that were marketing focused and otherwise before that. So I've worked for two different value-added resellers that are based in Virginia and have a Virginia Commonwealth footprint predominantly, but have been fortunate to be able to work from this region out of Roanoke for both over those years. My role has changed. I've generally been sales centric. Last year, I was moving into the role that Mark described, and then our company was acquired by a company called Intervision in August of last year. I should be updating slides, but as you're going to see, most of these slides are kind of slapped together anyway, so updating them seemed to be kind of a fruitless. A little bit about me. So I went to JMU up the road, grew up in Northern Virginia. After a little bit of time in Charleston, South Carolina, that I can't even begin to believe why I ever left, but I vacationed there much better than I ever lived there. Have been in Roanoke for 25 years. And as I said, I've been a part of that technology story for most of that time. Got 6 children, one of whom is going to be finishing college next year, the next that will be starting college next year. So I think these are all financial people tied to higher ed. From what I understand, I hate you all. I will be in debt to everyone in this room or your counterparts for the rest of my life. I one day hope to retire before I die. We'll see how that goes. But 4 biological kids that are 21, 18, 15, and 13. My now ex-wife and I were a resource family for 10 years, taking care of foster kids, and found ourselves, even though we weren't shopping for full-time employment at that point, adopting 2 boys who are identical twins that are now going to be 8 next month. So it's a busy household. As I said, these slides are kind of slapped together a little bit, and I'll tell you why. We've been talking about this topic in different iterations for probably the last 5, 6, 8 years. Security has kind of become the overwhelming topic in our industry. One of the things that I'll encourage you to take away is that anything you're evaluating that touches IT, that touches technology, needs to have a robust security story. IT security, cybersecurity, no longer something that you plan and then deploy throughout your network, your environment, out into the cloud, but it's something that you should be planning as a part of every investment you make in security. And so in that regard, at my company SyCom, we had have a penetration testing service that we developed in-house several years ago. And one of the things, because I'm a bit of a talker, we're going to see if I just get iterative, somebody wave at me and we'll give you time back, because I think that may be at the root of why my marriage ended. I'm kidding. But I'm really just going to tell the same story a couple of different ways. One of the things that I've done as we've developed our incident response group in recent years, as we developed our penetration testing service, is I've been the resource that's been brought in to try and bridge the gap of those technology solutions to business relevance. So generally what I do is just come up with stories to try and connect to folks like you. And throughout many of these different slides that have been put together for this purpose, the one response I've gotten that gives me encouragement that I'm not going to miss the mark terribly is IT people often ask for my slides because they needed to have a narrative to come back and explain to folks like you. Hopefully we'll be able to get that done together. So I'm going to talk a little bit first about what I think should orient you and your priorities. This is not about the CIA. We actually work with the FBI when we're doing incident response, but I'll touch base on that. We'll look at a couple of governing bodies. Nist was already mentioned, so I'll touch on that as well. There's nothing about cybersecurity if you don't have a couple of scary stories to tell, so I'll try and jolt you into understanding why this is so important. Then I'll try and give you a little bit of a historical perspective, kind of like we just had around crypto, how we got to where we are, why this is such a terrible problem. And then we'll get into what we can do now. As I said, we've got an incident response group that's been working with customers like you for several years. So we've got an insider's view, and we had already put together kind of our positioning statement on what you should be doing at the minimum to ensure that you're less likely to experience a ransomware attack, which is the predominant problem of our times. I'll give you the vision of our rescue team that would say, if you don't want to have to call 911, do these things. And then a few parting thoughts. So starting with you all. This is not specific to higher ed, but I always like to talk first about what you are focused on. Some people come into a conversation with myself or with our firm, and they're focused on security initiatives. They're not looking in the context of business predominantly. They just want to understand specifically, I'm trying to solve security problems. I'm tackling cybersecurity as a standalone initiative. Sometimes that's in light of industry requirements. There aren't a lot of requirements in your space, although if you're state funded or have some state funding, there's a lot of question around your reporting requirements to the federal government. Should you experience an incident? A lot of the language that we use, the difference between an incident and a breach, gets very difficult when you start talking about policy and guidance from both state and federal authorities. My friend Randy Marchaney, who's the CISO down at Virginia Tech, hates their interpretation or the gaps in their interpretation that make it sound like even if he just experiences an attempt to breach his perimeter, that he's beholden to report that to the authorities, which is just overhead that nobody could ever keep up with. But it's not likely. I have not seen regulations except secondarily, for instance, if you're beholden to GDPR because you are doing transactions online and those kinds of things, that's where you start to blend into regulations that might guide some of your investments. Business initiatives come first. That I think if you're, again, I would say that where this matters is if you have initiatives about outreach to students and the like, you need to be mindful of how that may impact your security posture. And then obviously all the challenges that all of us face every day. Again, I only identify this because I think it's important for you to be thinking about where do I enter into this topic of cyber? What are my individual initiatives and priorities? And then in the context of that, we tackle cyber with those in mind. I'll come back to that. Oh, there's a nice poll. Yeah, for those remote and online. This is new to me. Actually, this is kind of exciting, and I'm a little nervous. When I agreed to the gig, I said, "What time do I have to log in?" And turns out I get to actually see and talk. It makes it harder for me to turn my video off and run to the bathroom if I need to, but I'll try and get through that. Also, when I had to iron this morning, there was all kinds of new things. Ironing seemed to be less of a factor. If I just checked the humidity, I would have walked out and let God do its work. It didn't matter. So, okay, so we are, that's good. I think that it's heartening to me that there's some mindfulness that security of its own is a topic. Interesting though. Okay. So let me define the CIA in light of that, and then we're going to put those two topics together. CIA Triad is this concept that all three of these things are important to everybody, right? We need to have confidentiality of records. You can't have everybody seeing either financial information or even just student, if we want to call it. Availability, you need to be able to ensure that people can get to those records, can get to the information that they need. So it's confidential and it's available. And then it's the integrity of those records. Is it reliable information? When I look at my grades and you tell me I've got a B, does everybody else get to see that? Breaking confidentiality. Is it available to me when I need it? And when I get to it, can I trust it? Now, all three of these things are the makeup, the foundation of what drives cybersecurity initiatives and what drives your focus. They're all three important to everyone, but they're uniquely important to individual organizations based on their priorities and their initiatives. So let me walk through a couple of examples to try and drive that home, and this will also be a polling opportunity. If I was to talk about Amazon, the world's largest online reseller of goods and the owner of AWS, where people have information, generally speaking, would you say that confidentiality is their primary concern, that integrity of data is their primary concern, or that availability is their primary concern? And I will give you a chance to log your answer. Confidentiality, integrity, or availability. I want to make sure that I make this clear. Integrity, because we stumble around this even when we talk inside of security circles. Integrity is not about whether I trust you as a group or an organization or whether you're morally or ethically good or bad. It's just about the data and whether I trust the data when I find it. This is funny. I want you to know that everybody, this is great. This is a great orientation. Because with AWS, the answer is actually availability. And honestly, feel good, don't feel bad. Everybody gets that one wrong. I think that's why we put it first. Our CISO developed this slide to try and make this point. The reason that availability is predominant for Amazon is that if they're not available, you can't transact business. So they would, again, all three being important, you can't distrust their records, and you want to be sure they're keeping you confidential. They could recover if they had a breach and people got your credit card information. It's not fun, but they could recover. It's still an important thing. But what drives them first and foremost in everything they do is ensuring that customers have availability so they can transact. Because every minute that they're down is a minute that they lose real revenue. And I can tell you that at their level and at many retailers, they could tell you exactly how much revenue they lose for every given minute that they're down. Federal government, confidentiality, integrity, or availability. See if we pick up on a different rhythm. Of course, everybody knows it's not availability. I gave you that answer, right? We're narrowing the field. All right. Oh, I might have jumped the gun. Confidentiality for the government, and predominantly this is because of defense record keeping. There's a lot that has gone on in recent years. In fact, guided by Nist, and we've had a lot of engagements in my industry around this that have been downstream into secondary vendors who work for master contractors. The federal government has been pushing cyber requirements all the way down their supply chain. Because think about, here's a great example, and I've got a lot of time, so I'm going to talk a lot. If you had the plans, if you were a concrete provider, it's not that big one box thing, right? You're a part of building a federal building, and you have plans that you use to determine how much concrete you need to deliver, and you are a subcontractor to a subcontractor to a subcontractor. The federal government has been slowly pushing all the way down to those subs of subs of subs to say, you need to ensure the confidentiality of my records, because if you let my plans get out of sight to whomever, it becomes a genuine security risk to the nation. So the confidentiality of those records is utmost, and they have to be able to demonstrate that they maintain those records confidentially all the time. This one's a layup, because I will tell you, I don't have repeat answers. But for Wells Fargo, confidentiality, integrity, or availability. This is not 100%. Oh, somebody. Yeah, sorry, I'm kidding. It's fine. Wells Fargo has an integrity concern, predominantly. And the reason, again, being a breach that costs them a record, you're going to be upset. You're going to want them to document to you that they recovered your records and that you're not exposed and your password hasn't been shared with everybody in the world. But if you log into your bank and you believe you've got $10,000 and they say you've got 500, you are not going to bank there very long. That is a real issue. You need to be able to rely on the information that they maintain, that their ledger matches your ledger. And the minute that you suspect that they're not doing a good job of managing your data to that end, that they're making errors, that they're not applying payments to your mortgage the way that they should, or any of that, it's time to change. Now, again, I want to make it clear, all three of those things are always critical to every investment you make, to every choice you make around security. All of them are important. All we're talking about is what is the overriding value. And industry-wide, I mean, in your organization, I don't think you may all have the same answers. I would say that if you're going to go back and have a meeting with the board, if you're going to talking to your counterparts about the overriding guidance, answering these questions is what connects you to where you lay out policy and procedure, where you're making investments, what you're training in, how vital it is that you maintain adherence to training and policy. One of these will likely dominate what you believe is the most important, and by virtue of that, the combination of where you are focused, what you're investing in, and the determining factor of confidentiality versus insurance. Difference. Wow, it's an interesting little slideshow. It was fun. All right. So in light of what we've covered, I'd just be curious. Now, applying it actually to yourself. You know, I'd just be curious in higher ed. I'm curious to see if there's a consensus for you guys. I would believe that's probably right. When I tell one of my scary stories, I will talk about confidentiality. But again, it's shades of gray and what we saw as we make investment decisions. But integrity makes sense to me. Availability may matter more as digital assets and things that we all just heard about unfold. In fact, I could just scrap all this and start talking about DAOs and Web 3.0 and how it's going to transform your industry, but that's probably not what I was brought here to do. But I love the cyber thing. If you want to grab me and get bored at drinks or something, a dinner party, I'm happy to fulfill that obligation. Governing bodies in our space, there are many, but this is the one that really is the predominant guidance. And so if you're looking for a list of things that you want to focus on, I do think this has been revised. There may be more than 20 controls. I don't know how well it conveys out to the live audience or online. The security, it's the governing body for the United States. I mean, they kind of have laid out the guidelines, and they do ongoing revisions around this. The general thought here is that the top 5 or 6 of these controls are that everything below that line is overwhelmingly met if you authentically address the top 5 or 6. So you don't need to get overwhelmed with everything, but generally speaking, if you're focused on reliable asset management, so that you've got inventory control, that you're managing your assets, both software and hardware and the like, that everything at the top of the list addresses those things below, or if you wanted to start from the bottom up, you would be checking things off the list as you sought to authentically check off the top 5 or 6 controls. This is an easily Googled reference, and again, I think it's been revised and updated. I think there's only 5 basic controls, and then the rest are subservient. We heard a little bit about Nist earlier, and I think I also mentioned it. So Nist is it's like the ISO. But Nist would have guidance that's specific to tackling the structure of CIS, and then it's got subsets. Like there's a Nist control for what I talked about earlier. Subs to subs have to address the Nist control of the data that they receive and how they make sure that it's kept confidential and the like. And then you see this get iterative, but the bottom is the structure for testing against those, the penetration testing strategy. So it mirrors Nist, it mirrors CIS, but when you do penetration or risk assessments, you're following a similar path that is you're using to test against the environment to ensure or gaps. Does that make some sense? Trying to give you different views because different things speak to different people. I'm going to revisit this in a little bit with actually my view of how all things cyber are evaluated. So I'm going to give you a lot of options to try and retain some information here. Figure if you're going over between 20%, and I say everything 5 times, then we're going to have a 100% hit rate. So for the scary stories. Some of you may be familiar with this, or you'll pick up on who it was. I'm not going to talk about specifics or name anybody that has been harmed. But my scare story is one that was published here in the local news. It was in 2018. It was a financial institution that is somewhere within a 30-mile radius of us, I think. And boy, it was a train wreck. So it just illustrates things that you need to be aware of, because I do want to value out. I'm not really a scare tactic person, but I do want to give you some concrete purchase to what we're fighting against. So this is kind of an analog that'll help us illustrate what we're all up against. But this financial institution was targeted by a Russian hacker. We never really found out who it was. The predominant one at the time was a group called Fancy Bear, so I just used that as a reference point. But I don't think if you looked it up, you would find that they ever materialized in a way that we could be certain of. Oh, Blacksburg, I did kind of hone in on who this was. So a financial group was targeted in Blacksburg, and bad things unfolded, beginning with what's called a phishing campaign. Many of you probably are aware of this. I'm going to circle back to this later when I get to some of the things. Phishing with a PH, which is basically where a bad guy sends email to you portraying himself as somebody else. I fell victim to this once, sideline of a soccer game. I've had to put my phone down so I don't actually text people while I'm supposed to be talking to you because it would happen. But I'm quick to respond, and they caught me in a bad moment. Several years ago, Netflix said, hey, your payment didn't go through. And I knew that was going to be bad for me as a father in my household. This was bad. So I quickly, oh gosh, I clicked, touch, click, go to the page, put in my credentials to log into Netflix. And it was about that time that my radar got, wait a second. One, I didn't change anything. Why would my payment not go through? But then something looked weird. So I scrolled back, revealed the actual address from the Netflix email, which was not Netflix, it was Netflix-like, and quickly surmised that I had been phished and that I'd just given away my credentials. Now, I had just, in the recent months before I got that email, finally figured out the import of not using the same password for everything in the world. So I was fortunate to have already gone through that exercise. I will pause here and just give you the biggest tip that will impact your personal resiliency against cybercrime. You cannot reuse a password, ever. One password for every portal you use. So for me, I had to do a quick check because I knew that I had gone through that exercise and kind of cleaned up my own life password-wise, but I was still nervous. So I cycled through a few things, looked at the password list on my phone, rapidly logged into Netflix and changed that password. And that was the first thing I did. And then I kind of checked it. I was good, no worry. But the problem is that had I reused that password and username, I had just given the bad guys through that portal my username and password, and they could start trying it everywhere. My bank account, Amazon, to buy something, Uber to get a ride. I mean, who knows whatever else, right? So this is why you don't reuse passwords. Second tip, personal or otherwise, MFA, I'll circle back to that later, but multi-factor or dual authentication is also your friend. I do not currently know my Apple password. It uses my face. Sometimes it doesn't use my face. I don't know why. It doesn't seem to make sense. It doesn't happen when I expect it. But when it doesn't use my face, it says, tell me your password. And I say, I do not know. I forgot my password. I don't care because almost everything in my life is multi-factor. And if I don't know the password, I say, I don't know. It sends me a link to my phone. It knows it's me. Nobody else has my phone. It's a secondary avenue to validate my identity. And I just reset my password with another made up thing that I immediately forget. I don't have it written down. I don't have a list. I don't use a password LastPass or other people. Some people do. I get nervous because I'll forget that password. If you forget that password, you're in real trouble. But one password to every site and just use dual authentication like it's your best friend and never worry again. Anyway, they didn't do that. So with this phishing campaign, back to our narrative, our story, they didn't do that. So this phishing campaign targeted people who had authentic credentials, and they used our best intentions against us. It appeared to be the IT group saying, hey, we are cycling through and asking to reset your password. So well-meaning folks within this organization, this financial organization, and they logged into the portal that was presented to them, not knowing that instead of changing their password for the organization, they were giving their password to the Russian hackers. Those guys occupied several passwords and started to wander around inside of the organization's data center, unbeknownst to anyone, because by all aspects, by all respects, they were authentic. They were who they said they were. This is also where authentication would have helped, because identifying them and challenging them with a secondary request would have solved the problem. But be that as it may, they used those passwords, gained access. And this is where it gets really to worry about. But as they infiltrated the organization, they looked up individual user information. They used that information to create dummy cards, debit cards, and they scraped pins. And on one day, they sent people out throughout America and got cash on machines to the tune of $500,000 in one day. That was not ever recovered. All that money was gone, not from the individual accounts, but it was gone from the institution. In fact, this institution didn't even know it had happened. Visa's own information and cyber caught that this was an irregularity and that there were too many transactions happening that looked too similar in too many different places, financial group based in Blacksburg, and they alerted the bank and said, this doesn't look right. And by the time they turned it off, $500,000 was out the door. Frighteningly, 6 months later, after they had remediated and thought they had it fixed and had done all that they thought they needed to do and cashed in on their cyber insurance policy the first time, they did it again for $2 million more. It was calamitous. And we don't even know the extent to which the costs were behind the scenes. We do know that they had real issues getting cyber to pay again because their cyber insurance said, oh, this is the same incident. We've already paid. So scary story. Just illustrates what's at stake, not necessarily for you guys. But I will tie this back to two things that I do know that matter. One kind of a funny and almost a fun story. There was a 911 or an emergency response about a year and a half ago, also in our region, definitely will go unnamed. We won't talk about anybody that we've done incident response for. In this case, they didn't have good backups. They didn't have a good remediation plan, have data loss prevention. There was just not much in place. And so we quickly surmised they're going to have to pay crypto. They're going to have to figure out how to put together a coin. And as we brokered the conversation with the bad guys, they said, oh, by the way, who are you? Because it was an incidental. I'll talk about this in a minute, but this is like, they weren't going after the emergency response center. They were just throwing their little bugs out into the world. Whatever they hit, it's all generally automated and kind of comes back. And when we told them it's an emergency response center, which I thought was a bad idea because I felt like the ransom would go up, they cut it in half. They said, oh, we don't mean to mess with the police and an emergency response. How about if I cut you a break? So that's a funny outcome. The independent college, my circle, that there is a group a few states away, but in nominally the mid-Atlantic or the Southeast, that had a breach. That the breach was an exfiltration. So the difference between when the bad guys come in and they lock down your data and they make you pay ransom for the keys versus when they exfiltrate. So they exfiltrated the data and were holding it hostage, and the negotiations went poorly, and they thought that they could recover and that they had some data loss prevention in place that they didn't. And the net is that there is a college somewhere in our sphere of influence that to this day, if you call to get your transcripts, they actually ask if you have records because they don't have any of their student records anymore. And I don't know at this point in time if they've had to shutter their doors, but it's been a pretty frightening scenario. And I found campaign asking for students to provide data back so they could repopulate. So there's a lot at stake, obviously. Anyway, into the scare tactics. But it wouldn't be a cyber scary. So historically, and this is where a lot of the, when I tackled why does penetration testing, why would you want to do a penetration testing service, which by the way, I'm not here to advocate for or try and get you to buy. But when I was trying to think through, the biggest thing was educating you guys on why and how this has become so bad and where penetration testing and other solutions fit in. So historically, and some of this is dated, but whether this is Atlanta is one that everybody points to because Atlanta started their negotiation with we don't negotiate with terrorists, which was a bad idea because I don't know the last count, but I think the request was in the 1.5 million range, and they had already spent 10 million to try not to negotiate. I can tell you that when we airdrop into an incident, one of the first things that we're tackling is should we just pay or not? Now, I'll talk about that in a little more detail later. But the headlines are a little bit of scare. But the background is this, way too abbreviated. I'm sure that this gets even bigger and wider over the last 5 or 6 years. But we can kind of look at the genesis of ransomware and of cyber attacks somewhere around 2005. It wasn't anything that any of us knew about for at least another 10 years. You can see how rapidly it expanded even in that time frame. And again, if I tacked on the last 5 years, it would be so big we wouldn't be able to see it. The one thing I want to call your attention to is how iterative it is. So these yellow things are basically, in 2015, somebody figured out CryptoLocker, and then there are iterative instances of that attack that just kind of expanded and were all leveraged similarly to a nefarious end, right? The reason I talk about that a little bit is I want you to understand why this has become such a predominant problem in society and worldwide. It's these 3 reasons. One is there's automation. So I don't have to be a hacker anymore. I don't have a guy that types a million words a second and has scrolling green matrixy looking things on the screen. I don't have to be smart. I just have to be industrious because there's a free market. There's a black market for everything on that previous screen and for everything you're likely to see leveraged against you. I don't have to have the skills of development. I just have to have a credit card. I go on the black market. I purchase the attack or the string of attacks generally, where you've got something that finds a gap, that once inside triggers something else that exploits a gap. And at some point, it does invite you individual personal intervention to fully take advantage of the attack. But all of those tools are fully baked, and I can just buy them for generally $500 to $5,000. And then I just kind of launch them out of the world and see what comes back, see what I find. And this is an issue, and in your roles, I would definitely be mindful, it's good cause, that legacy support, things like Microsoft, older versions of what have you. One of the things that's at stake, if you are maintaining legacy products that are either not being updated with security or not even being updated at all, we all have some, these older things that are vital to our business. Those are huge security gaps. And they need to be identified and fenced in around specifically because, and we see it in healthcare, by the way, things like MRI machines that have a high value but don't keep a maintenance of the software. So we need to identify those things in our organizations and make sure that we secure them. Any of those legacy supports. These are the three vectors that I can automate and don't have to be intelligent because I can buy in the free market and overwhelmingly I can exploit. And just think about this for phishing campaigns or anything else, similar to mail campaigns. I think that in marketing, it's well known that your open rate for mail is somewhere shy of 3%. Most of it goes in the trash. And then once I get you to open, it's all about converting. Similar here. If you solve your legacy support problem, you solve probably 95% of your issues apart from phishing and your own human resource issues, concerns. Because they aren't worried about the people who are secure. As they get 3% return on throwing things out into the world, they're going to find that that's a fairly successful business, and that's the place we live. Oh, look at that. I have like information I could have told you about. I'm sorry. Yeah, some costs. Ransomware toolkit for $1,800. I think that's a little stale. I can buy credit cards for $30, maybe yours. Certainly one from that financial organization. And that's a little bit about even just Microsoft and how things are being eclipsed. The further to the left you go, the less supportive they are. Scary. Anyway. But the number one reason that it has exploded is because it works. Because they get that 3% converts into X Bitcoins, that are a secure transaction, no matter how bad a guy you are, unfortunately. Even though I'm a huge fan, like I said, we can talk about DAOs until you tell me to stop talking. A little bit of insight on the cost of a breach. This is really stale, but it's a story that a lot of us know in the industry. It just gives you some sense of just topically the things that you would be addressing if you were to experience a breach. They had 40 million credit and debit cards stolen. This was, by the way, through an HVAC vendor who had access to them to be able to manage the HVAC in stores, but they didn't have that vendor firewalled. And so people got in through the vendor system that was just an IoT management, of HVAC. And then the scary thing about Target, by the way, was they sat there for 6 months undetected. So they just kind of poked around for a while before they finally pulled the trigger and started to do their bad things. So they had a bunch of records stolen. They had hard costs for reissuing cards and the cash that was used against them. And then they had all kinds of secondary issues. Now, bringing that more back to you guys, we do know that there's kind of an idea, we have a very clear idea, of both the direct costs, I'll touch on these in more, and then the indirect costs, downtime, when this happens. We do disaster planning with companies or with organizations. One of the things we say is, what happens if it's on a Thursday and payroll was supposed to be issued Friday? Do you outsource payroll, or do you have to figure out how to get paychecks? Because those kinds of unforeseen impacts have real weight. People don't like not getting paid. So anyway, the general worldwide cost per record, not per breach, not, but per, like, if you have 1,000 students, it would be 141 times 1,000. I'm no better at math than the last speaker, but it's a lot. And that's actually global. The American cost is generally higher, closer to $200 per record would be your all-in cost if this were unfold in your environment. And again, I'm just saying a few, it's kind of the same thing. There's a lot of themes here, same things, different ways, different visuals. But root causes of breaches, the highest thing being malicious or criminal attack. There are issues with system glitches. You just lose your own data. You didn't have a backup, or you thought you had a backup when you needed it, it wasn't there. That occur. In Virginia Beach, there was an instance where a vendor had done something right, but was told they'd done it wrong, and they couldn't find their own records of having, they knew they did it right, but they couldn't prove it because they couldn't find their own records anymore. Just kind of been lost in their data center. And so they ended up having to pay some kind of non-completion fine to for a building that they erected. And then human error, which is where the phishing comes in, which is where the people that work for you in today's world are actually probably the biggest contributor to failures in your own cyber posture. Oh, yeah, okay. Cute little things that I forgot I did years ago. So what to do now? So I'm going to talk about this, and it's not going to be very pretty, and then I'm going to make it pretty specific. There's a lot. This is what overwhelms folks like you with slides like this, right? Because I understand what most of this means. Awareness training, particularly around phishing, trying to make the people that are your riskiest part of your solution. Investing in tools that help you identify phishing attacks as they unfold. DNS. Anybody here know what DNS is? When your router or whatever, when you type in Amazon.com, behind the scenes, Amazon.com is like 192.168. something or other. And none of us remember that. I think we can only remember how many digits are a phone number generally, and not that anymore. But the DNS is what makes that conversion, so you get to have the convenience of remembering retail names and the like, and it just makes it into an address that can be used in the network. Those DNS lookups, kind of a phone book for DNS, can also be used to identify bad guys. Again, there's a numbers game for them overwhelmingly. It's not likely, even for your institutions, that you'll be a primary attack vector. You'll be an incidental, right? So one way that you can do that is if your phone book, your lookup, is aware and saying, wait a second, Uzbekistan has no need to be, why am I dialing this? And it just kind of intercedes when it knows that it's a known bad, because the bad guys aren't going to that much trouble to hide themselves. I touched on multi-factor, data loss prevention I'll talk about as well. Network segmentation is something you guys would never understand, but it's about breaking things up in the network so that bad things over here can't go do bad things over there. That's all IT babble, right? But I'm just trying to expose you. In fact, I'm going to expose you to a little more, just as overwhelming. Here's a great visual. I'll give you a few minutes, and then there'll be a test. These are all the products that somebody like me would gladly sell you, and that you, in conjunction with your IT people, need to sort through and prioritize. It's a lot. It's why I think the guidance that we talked about at the beginning, CIA and your personal initiatives, and holding all of your vendors accountable to how they address a complicated picture like this inside of the technologies that they're presenting to you. A simplified version lends itself to a little bit easier understanding. This is a layered strategy for security. So if you consider that your data is at the core, your mission critical assets, but then everything that you layer on top, including sometimes both the human layer and physical. Nist, for instance, for those subcontractors, requires some air gapping of physical assets. If you have a copy of my plans, I need you to document that that is air gapped and can't be copied or moved, and that you account for everybody that looks at it. So in security, whether it's video surveillance, locks on doors, I mean, it all is part of the puzzle, but it's layers. And in our recent times, one of the things that's been befuddling is how those layers have been changed significantly, both by COVID and work from home. and by hybrid computing, SaaS providers. You may be using an ERP or some other solution that's inherently in the cloud. So now those layers of security need to move outside of the server that you can walk into a building on your campus and look at, but out into the world where other things are hosted. And they need to be able to speak sufficiently to how they've secured those assets. And you need bridges out of your IT group that take your policies and your guidance and your priorities and bridge outside of your organization and to encompass things that are not hosted internally the way. So different visual on what I see as the continuum. Again, just trying to give you different ways to consider the same problem. So this is new at this point. I would tell you that every investment you make in cybersecurity is informed by, right? So you may or may not, I don't ask, it would not be comfortable for us to have, in my experience, a poll where you got to confess whether you've been hit by or had a breach. Because in this room, I guarantee there are people who have, and you probably don't want to talk. I won't ask that question. But those of you who've had a breach have probably had the experience of both spending money to get out of trouble and then spending money to keep yourself out of trouble that you wished you'd spent before. That's not me being a vendor trying to, I'm just telling you there's a reality to that. We'll touch on that again in a few minutes. But whether you've experienced a breach or you know that others have, or you're just fearful of a breach, an incident is what drives investment. And so you're actually responding to an incident, even if you've not had one, through adequate planning and investment. That takes generally two forms. One is people-centric, where we're developing policies, we're determining adherence, we're determining penalties against adherence. And the other, we're investing in technology, we're making plans, we're deploying products, all of that feeds back in, and whether you're doing a penetration test, whether you're doing a risk assessment, whether you're now remediating in real time, it's a continual loop. At the top of the group, we find that we have CISOs or virtual CISOs. And at the bottom, what we call blue team, which are the people that are architecting and making designs and guiding your investment and your architecture to prevent a breach. Sorry for the tag, it goes back to the old slide deck. And then what we would talk about if I were positioning the penetration service, which I'm not, would be red team exercises, where now I'm going to start testing against my environment to understand what would happen. It's also where we have tabletop exercises where we portray an incident and just ask questions. What are you going to do next? It's Thursday, payroll's tomorrow. What do we do now? What happens? What's step 3? Does the plan for disaster recovery address the actual incident that we're imagining? All of those things. And so it's just a continuous loop of evaluating, investing, training, deploying, and reevaluating. And that's the world we all live in, fortunately for those who get paid for stuff like that. Nope, we're built out, sorry. So however you want to think about it, and there's other ways to do it. I hope when I meet with folks like you who are not, I'm not talking about beeps and blips and networking as little as I can at least, is that one or some of these begin to resonate and give purchase predominantly to the people in your organization that are coming and asking for money. Not because you should just always say yes, because there is definitely overinvestment, poor investment. It needs to be plan informed. It needs to be driven by your priorities, including whether you believe confidentiality, integrity, or availability are the predominant driver for your group. All of those things, security investments are subservient to the mission and mandate of the business of the institution. But it needs to look something like this. And it means that when your IT professional is saying we should do X or Y, you can say, well, explain to me where that sits. Is that, what layer? Do you feel like we've adequately addressed data security and data loss prevention? Because I hear what you're talking about is endpoint security, which I think is important, but it feels like there's a hierarchy we should address. Or how does what we want me to spend money on reflect the initiatives that we've had to test against what I've already spent money? I'm not, and my experience is that IT people are as budget conscious as any. In fact, sometimes what we discover, we do workshops where we have both sides of the group, the business people and the IT people in the same room. Overwhelmingly what we find is they've made policy by virtue of investments that they have decided were important that the business didn't realize they'd made, and maybe isn't documenting, hasn't folded into their policy or adherence strategy, and or you guys have made decisions or preemptively, even if it's just budget, that they have a priority they can't fulfill. And a lot of what needs to happen in every group that I speak with is folks like you and IT finding common ground to have an authentic discussion about this to ensure that your priorities are in line and that the investments you make flow out of those shared priorities. I thought there was gonna be a lot of time. I wanna make sure I'm okay. All right, good, yeah. So this is the good stuff. Everything else, just trying to find common ground. I'll reiterate a few of those things now. This is the most recent material. I think I said I kind of stuck. You may even notice that slide didn't look like the last slide. Yes, it didn't. And people down here were angry because there was like 14 megs of data. I don't know how. So our group, we've developed an incident response group out of our virtual CISO consulting. We had a CIO consulting group years ago. And about 3 years ago, we determined that people don't need CIOs for rent, but they need CISOs. CISOs are a high dollar commodity. It's ungodly what you might pay to have somebody. And almost nobody, including you folks, have a need for a full-time CISO. And not a pitch. I will tell you that you do have the need for CISO oversight. And oftentimes that's where consulting comes into play. It's similar to, you may or may not have an in-house attorney. Even if you do, you definitely have one off, that they rely to. You've got people on speed dial you can call when you have a question, you have a problem, you need help and evaluation. So that CISOs are your for hire expertise that can be relevant, guiding policy, guiding investment, just a check. Out of that shift to CISO 3 or 4 years ago, we found that we were starting to get calls for people who needed to get out of trouble. So then we started hardening and developing a very replicable strategy to remediate incidents. We've been doing that for about 2.5 years. For a large portion of that, we've been partnered with law firms and with insurance providers, neither of whom I'll mention, but both of the insurance providers we've been invested in have been public sector. So we've done a lot of public sector work and in some higher ed incidents. That is not a fun business to be in. Bad guys hit on the weekends. It's ad hoc. We rent from our own group and from others to muster the response and align, my Microsoft team to rebuild Active Directory, or my networking team to understand how a firewall was breached, or any number of things that need to be rebuilt. So we have premium, we have to recruit our own people to be excited to lose their Saturdays and Sundays. Our consultants don't like losing that time either. It's a very high pressure scenario. And so the reason that we put this together, candidly, is because we don't want to do that. We would much rather be talking about how to prevent that than working to dig people out of the ditch. So this was a collaboration between myself and our CISO to try and translate what we see. Again, the predominant thing you need to be nervous about in today's time is ransomware. And when you're preventing against ransomware, you're overwhelmingly taking steps to prevent against other cyber crimes. So this is, in theory, what our emergency responders would say you should do. She'll come through and tell you that your house looks safe, right? So the first thing, even though this is kind of iterative at this point, but it is important. Maybe I should have started off with this, but never too late. This is a hostage crisis in every measurable way. Whether they've locked down your data and are holding it ransom to store it, which is not always a high percentage. There's actually a strange, I told you the story about the emergency response group and giving them a discount, but they actually do, particularly with home users. You'll hear stories about like your grandmother fell victim to a phishing campaign, and then they were so nice. They helped me put my computer back together. Part of that is because if word got out that the guys who are doing this aren't actually holding up their end of the bargain when you pay, bad for business. So they actually do tend to have a pretty high commitment to getting you what you need, but it's not high to the point that I would rely on their credibility to ensure that you get your data back. But it's a hostage crisis. They're holding you hostage, or that gets even worse because now they can punish you over and over again. You can't ever know that you've gotten it back. It's something that's important to you folks, and this is also where I mentioned the virtual CISO or consulting partnership. When we do a scope of work to estimate what it's going to take to dig a client out of trouble, one of the things that is in the line item document that you sign to get my group to help is that a fiduciary will attend every meeting. They're generally at least one a day, oftentimes two, just have a run rate, because when you are remediating an incident real time and you've got a target to be back online for students by Monday or to meet whatever it may be, there are decisions that need to be made quickly, and they oftentimes have financial ramifications of one type or another. So overwhelmingly, CFOs are the ones that are assigned that job. Also, in regulated industries, it's important to note that IT management and security are not allowed to be one and the same. So if you were in a regulated industry, your IT director can't be responsible for security oversight, because the guidances have determined that you can't check your own work effectively. Having somebody who's managing the environment and somebody who's responsible for the security of the environment. And oftentimes, if there's not a CISO, that falls to the CFO. Legal fees, that all adds up, oftentimes at least twice what my fees are. And then all the anticipated impacts of being down 2 to 5 days of conservative estimate. I think we generally see more like 7. And then there's all kinds of trouble that can follow that I'm happy to go into. I feel like I've scared you enough. This is an actual scrub. You can't see the names of protect the innocent stuff of a scope of work that we would give you if you had 250 endpoints or users, including virtual machines and whatnot in your data center. 100 grand, probably. In this case, some of that cost is driven by forensic analysis. Sometimes we don't do forensics, but there's a different type of engagement if we need to preserve information for federal or other oversight. So there's a lot of levers that drive cost, but this is a reasonable, not a scare tactic. This is an actual scope of work that we delivered to a customer and then delivered the work to help dig them out of trouble. So this is the part you want to pay attention to, because I would stand behind this. I'm going to put product to it because it's a touch point, so it gives you a little bit of purchase. But I'm not, again, I'm not. Then there's all kinds of names I could use. So the first thing that I would say is you need a sound strategy. Whether that, if you've not got documented policy, if you haven't thought about what accountability, adherence, and penalties look like, the guidance that my guys would give you, and I think good consultants should say, is don't write policy you're not going to enforce. So because now you've opened a rat's nest. If you're not going to create adherence, then don't write the policy. And some of that's culturally driven. You can't just upend and make people behave. You've got to determine that interim point where you can believe that people can participate and you can hold accountability, and then have maybe even a strategy how you can move that and be more aggressive over time. But a sound policy and strategies and planning, and I can talk about some of that more. Then there are only 3 technologies, specific ones, that we would say can overwhelmingly transform, and arguably a 4th. That yellow pages, the book that does, and again, some of the things, it just knows the bad places. They're well known. It's the difference between being on a list that knows when a bad person is trying to get in versus not. And when somebody gets a phishing email from ad Netflix, they don't get it. It just goes into a filter and it's not even counted, because regardless of how official it looks, or it just came from a place, it's very easy to know, and we just filter all that junk out. So DNS lookup. Multi-factor authentication, or sometimes called dual factor, but that's where you get that password reset. Oddly, it does become an enabler for IT, because a lot of what legacy IT organizations still do is manage password resets, and somebody can do it. So on the one hand, you get the efficiencies of enabling end user password and access, and on the other hand, you're also protecting yourself from, should someone credentials. Generally, those are set up so that one of the points we're challenged is if you are trying to gain access with good credentials, but from a place I haven't seen you before, or a machine I haven't seen you before. If a bad person, a bad actor, has my username and password, but they're logging in from who knows where, Jamaica, I haven't been logging in from Jamaica, and definitely not on that machine. And I say, oh, give me your password. And now that password reset comes to your actual person's phone, and the attack is prevented. And then endpoint detection and response, which is, it used to be antivirus is what you would hear. Now people really call it any malware or malware detection. Multiple layers you can continue to lay on top of that, a lot of intelligence you can wrap around it. There are a lot of things you can do. But overwhelmingly, if you can authentically check the box for each of these three, you have taken a huge step forward to making sure that you're better protected against a cyber attacker leveraging ransomware. And then the fourth would be VPN. So it's very standard in our industry that if you're not here, you have to establish a VPN tunnel, a virtual private network tunnel. And that by virtue of doing that, I can always challenge identity using the other tools. It's one more wrapper. And it also puts encryption around the data that's trafficking back and forth. Although for your organization, the exfiltration of data is not likely. It's just not something you guys need to worry about very much. But that VPN piece, often low cost, and allows you to police people who are trying to gain access when they're not on your campus. Monitoring and response with a team. So this is probably the bitterest pill that for people who are fiduciaries, but I'm going to be candid. A security operations center, a SOC, is something none of you have. And if you think you have it, it's not appropriate. It's not appropriately staffed, both in the amount of time that resources are devoted to policing your security and in their acumen and training. This is the space where vendors like me have always lived. When you moved from Active Directory to Office 365, your guys could do that, and they may have, and it may be successful. But what we would say is we've done it a million times. So we've got the expertise. Your one-time event is run rate for us. Why don't you trust? Sometimes you guys do it, and sometimes you don't. It is never more important than in this space. We've partnerships with several. I won't mention them. You can do your research and find credible SOC providers. What I would ask you to be measuring from a cost standpoint is they have a team of people. This is all they do. They're good at it. They interpret data that's a false positive, things that would look scary to me, and I would go, oh my gosh, stop that. They go, no, that happens all the time, credibly. And then things that I think are innocuous, they go, oh, no. Let's jump on this and do it. I have SOC providers that don't want to say this because they're actually afraid that if they say it out loud and then they have a breach, that it'll mess up all their marketing. But I have one SOC provider that's been doing this for 6 years and has a 0% breach rate because it's a staffed group of people, and this is all they do. And they can go, hey, Bob, is this a problem? And they've got tools that are doing a lot of automation around it. I can't even begin to estimate what that cost would be. It depends on your environment and what you're doing and a bunch of other stuff. But I will tell you, it should be a human resource question. And I know, particularly in your industry, and I'm not unfamiliar with everything that you guys are facing, and there's a lot of call for different investments. If you have a resource leave your IT group, I would think about a SOC instead of backfill. Now, don't tell your IT people I said that because they already have more work to do than they want, and they're frustrated you guys aren't giving them somebody else, I'm sure. But I'm just telling you, this should be something you should look actively to solve, or at least have some vendors come evaluate you and give you a quote so you understand the cost. I would say that generally what I see is it's about a head count in your environment, but that's I've loaded costs and all. But so enough said. But that's a huge. In fact, if I was they will require endpoint detection and multi-factor. They may not require DNS, and they'll let you decide about. So this is another kind of, if you do that, you'll have done a couple of other things. But you have something that's doing at least 2, if not all 3 of the technical investments. So you might want to evaluate whether they're doing well and whether they're credible, if they're cost, But if you haven't looked at a SOC, it would be an active step that you can take and then decide not to spend the money. That's fine, I understand. We can't spend money on everything. But you should evaluate. The human factor, how do you translate? Because right now, including probably people in this room, people are your biggest problem. You've got a bunch of people of varying acumen and age and experience and willingness and they are going to be the likely breach point. Phishing is the overwhelming access way. We're remediating since we make with DNS and other things. So a plan to recruit them into your cyber strategy instead of working to overcome their flaws is an important part. It's also about the least cost. I'll talk about that in a second. And then some way to ensure that you have a good data protection strategy, a data loss prevention strategy, a backup. One thing you could jot down and ask your IT person, the guidance is 3-2-1. You want 3 copies, 2 mediums, 1 offsite. Do you want, for all the data that is mission critical that you can't afford to lose, you need copies of it. 1 can be on a disk and 1 can be on a piece of paper. I don't know, it can be on a SAN over here and it can be wherever. And then 1 of those should be offsite or immutable. We heard a little bit about that with crypto. Something that can't be touched, because when an attacker comes in, the first thing they look for is backups. And oftentimes you won't know they're there until they've gotten your backups and now you're in trouble. In fact, the overwhelming determinant of whether or not you'll pay crypto is that bottom line. If we show up and say, okay, where are your backups? Can we look at, do you have reliable backups? What are we going to do? And the answer is, no. We don't have anything off site. And we check that first and it's locked down, locked tight. Okay, call the attorney because we're going to need to pay. It's a pretty quick answer. Doesn't get us a scope of work, but that's pretty much how it goes. So I can put names to that. You can hire my guy. Happy to do that. Happy to rent him out to you. If you were a Cisco shop, some of the words you would hear would be umbrella. Fortinet's got great answers in this space. This is just kind of giving you purchase. I'm not worried about it. Nobody here is going to buy anything from me today. I don't even sell anything. It's not my job. Umbrella, Cisco Duo. You need to look hard if you're using Microsoft, and there's things that you should investigate about whether that's adequate. But it's come a long way. It didn't used to be something we'd recommend in certain environments. It's okay to just use Microsoft's multi-factor. And then endpoint protection. So anything that says malware. I mean, not anything, but that's what you want to be looking for. Oh gosh, I said I wasn't going to say their name, and then I did. Okay, CyberSafe. There are groups, so let's pretend I didn't say they've never had a breach because they don't want me to do that. But there's another one. CyberSafe has standards on what it will and won't protect. You may have added investment, but I do know they're reliable. We've had great outcomes. They're actually part of our incident response team when we land in an environment. But Arctic Wolf is one that you can look at because they basically will manage any environment, but they don't do automated remediation. So basically what they do is alert back to your team to do not remediation of an incident, but like, this is a bad thing, you should fix it. They alert you, and then they will, and there's others. The SOC provider, know before, cheapest investment everybody in this room can make. I don't think I've ever seen it cost more than $10,000 for like 3 years. It's a phishing platform, so your IT team can generate and send their own campaigns out to see if people are in adherence or have learned their lesson. Then they can revisit that training with people. And it's got training modules within it, so you can use it as a front-loaded training. You can even have, I think, certifications. Like you can have everybody in your group that has to go through their training, but it's like super low cost. I mean, don't kill me if it's more than 10 grand, but 3 years for very little cost, and it helps you get people in your organization on the right page to be a part of the solution instead of the problem. And then data protection is a sprawling space, and the ways in which you might address that, I would just say you need to feel confident that should something happen, you have a copy that you can restore from. And one of the things we'll do is come in and do an assessment, give you kind of a checkup from the neck up. You can get that from other firms. You can meet with vendors and have them, free pre-sales is your friend. Get somebody to come in and tell them you're willing to buy something. Just that they've got to explain to you what and why to buy, and they'll do some evaluation and say this is a gap you should fill. This is actually where people ship a tape off to Iron Mountain, and I mean, there's a lot of ways to do it, cheap and expensive, but you need to have confidence that your mission critical data is protected should it be occupied or exfiltrated, stolen. I think this is my last slide. Gosh, I can talk for an hour. People will be so pleased. So this is what I would, just kind of bring it all to a point. I hope, it's like I told the same story 8 different ways, but I hope some of it landed. I would definitely consider, you don't need to put somebody on retainer, and we and others do that, but there are things you can do, like come in and give me a risk assessment. Just give me a top-down look. How much am I at risk? And a risk assessment is different from like a bunch test. It's talking about the value of what you have, right? So a risk assessment should identify if you've got a bunch of locks on a door, but there's nothing inside the door, where somebody can tell you put something valuable in there or reallocate your security to something that needs to be protected. So it's an evaluation of not just whether someone can get to things, but how valuable and what the impact of those things are, should they be lost, occupied, etc. That's a group, or those resources are the type that can help with documenting policy and guidelines in light of adherence. That's also, by the way, policy creation also tends to come out of the legal field. So there are specialists in legal that are very cyber-centric. And so you may have relationships already with folks that if you just asked, hey, do you have, whoever your attorney or help. Remember that adherence matters. And then disaster planning. So this is not just about architecture and technology investment, but about an actual plan. And there is a big difference between, as foster parents, we were exposed to we had regular training. In fact, I can't believe that we don't make parents at large go to training, but that's a different talk for another time. But you read this book, read that book. I was asking one of the people that presented at one of those events, I said, well, what do you think is the most important? And they said, what the most important is? The difference between parents who read books about being better parents and those who don't. And that's what I would say here. If you have taken the time to meet internally and talk about how you would react in a disaster, you are setting yourself wildly apart from those who have. And particularly when it's business driven, not just IT. IT probably has some plans here, but they're not going to be adequate if they don't understand your priority. And then you can test your answers. Penetration testing, again, we have a group that does that. There's plenty of people that provide those services. Tabletop exercises, which is where you put that disaster plan to the test, where we all sit around and say, okay, X just happened. What do you do? Oh, step 1 in the guide is we do this, and then we do that. Well, did step 4 really tackle what was at stake, or did we miss something? Do we need to revisit that? Ensure you've got validated backups. And then bottom line, with your priorities, your investments in mind, with the heart of the institution coming first, do your best to make wise investments. And I would encourage you in this space to value expertise. And, that's where people that aren't in your organization probably have a wider view and more value to offer than you might consider. So, if you should want, I am more than happy. Our consulting group generally does this is just my only little thing, but we'll do like an hour sit down with you and or your IT people. Just kind of ask, what are you doing for this? What are you doing for that? That sounds like something you might want to look at. It's a loss leader. We generally, those hour consults sometimes lead to more consulting engagements. They sometimes lead to a risk assessment or something you see on the screen. They sometimes lead to evaluating and making a purchase. But we do feel like it gives folks like you an opportunity to have some authentic feedback on where those investments have been. And the last thing I'll say as I wrap up, and thank you all for your time and for listening to my scratchy voice for so long. But try and be in the room together. You will be amazed if you have someone who's credible and knowledgeable in this space, spend time with you and your IT leadership to ask you questions. What will be revealed about your posture in just that one thing? Because you've got to find a way to tie those together effectively and authentically if you're going to be safe.